Good afternoon, everybody, excellencies, delegates, experts, dear colleagues, dear friends. A very warm welcome to this session on Monday afternoon on the topic of environmental, social and governance, ESG, traceability of supply chains. It's a great pleasure for UNECE, Economic Commission for Europe, to convene this session as part of the WTO Public Forum. I think it's been a very intensive day here in the WTO discussing many important trade and environment issues. We have in UNECE also had an intensive day discussing many trade, investment, financing related issues in the preparation for COP27. And I'm still delighted that we can come together here at this late afternoon and share some further reflections. We will discuss ESG traceability of supply chains. And having been in the UNECE discussions on COP27 this morning, supply chains of critical minerals and the ESG dimension of these critical minerals was actually a whole panel we had discussing this. And I'm delighted to have some of the panelists here with us today. So now we will basically continue looking at this traceability along supply chains. We won't take a specific sector approach, but we look at it in a bit more a cross-cutting manner. And we will look specifically at the role of data and digitalization to support traceability. And we will try to explore a little bit what is the link to trade, maybe also to trade policy, because we are here in the WTO as part of the WTO Trade and Environment Week. Here, once again, a great appreciation to the WTO team for having UNECE organize one of the sessions, and we were delighted to also do so already as the part of the WTO Public Forum. Now, today, we not only discuss supply chain traceability, but we actually also discuss one of UNECE's flagship projects and products. That's our Sustainability Pledge. Sustainability Pledge for improving ESG transparency and traceability in the textiles and footwear sector. These are sectors with very, I would say, difficult environmental and social conditions, and UNECE is working to foster ESG traceability there. Our Sustainability Pledge includes a policy recommendation, an information exchange standards, and also blockchain pilots. Our Sustainability Pledge has gone through the UNECE normative machinery. We do have a normative machinery where governments and experts get together to design policy tools and to adopt them. That's much more of a soft approach. That's not hardcore legally binding rules like in WTO, but there is a normative machinery that looks at these important topics. So I think that's all. As I said, we will look today at ESG traceability of supply chains. We'll look at the policy making dimension, what is happening at the national and regional level. And we will also look a little bit maybe at company practices because there is private sector involvement. What is clear is that in these discussions, there is a link to supply chains and to trade, to international trade. But we realized when preparing for this panel that the actual link between all these due diligence, sustainability standards and traceability standards between this body of policymaking and WTO or trade policy is very, very little explored. So I hope that we can have some initial thoughts about this maybe as part of the panel today. Now, coming to the panel, we have an amazing lineup, both here in the room and on the screen. And I have on my right-hand side, His Excellency, Mr. Ulugbek Lapasov, Ambassador of the Permanent Mission of Uzbekistan here in Geneva. And many thanks for joining us here today, for having also joined us 2 weeks ago. I would say Uzbekistan is not only an important member state of UNECE. For this audience here, important, you are a country acceding to WTO, so very interesting role here. Also quite important, you have quite a textile sector with an important cotton dimension, and I'm sure you will be able to share some very interesting insights here. We will then, just to quickly introduce the panel, on my left-hand side, I have Mr. Christian Hudson, who is having a very interesting affiliation as well. You're the lead EU G7 G20 environmental diplomacy support. And you're doing that through the means of GIZ, the German International Agency of Technical Cooperation. And so very happy to have you with us here today. And already this morning, you shared some very interesting insights with us on traceability in critical minerals. So delighted to have you. I then have two ladies here on the podium as well. On my far right, I have Ms. Ruby Lambert, who is Associate Economic Affairs Officer in UNCTAD, and specifically, Ruby, you are part of the UNFSS, the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, and is a really interesting initiative where also as UNECE, we have sort of started doing things jointly, and I look forward to your insights on the topic of ESG traceability. And then we have on my left-hand side, we have Eloise Tony, who is joining us from UNEP, and who is joining us from UNEP on a very specific sectoral angle, particularly chemicals. And I think, again, a very complex supply chains. And I very much look forward to hearing what you can tell us specifically about the global environmental facilitated projects that you are hosting. And we also have somebody joining us on the screen. I can see here Mr. Paul Rowland. Paul is the transparency lead of the Clean Clothes campaign. So definitely, again, an important actor when it comes to improving supply chains in the textile sector, in the textiles and footwear sector, and making them more environmental and sustainable, socially friendly. And Paul has had also many interactions and cooperations with UNECE as part of our textiles project. So many thanks, Paul, for joining us here today. So that's the lineup. And without further ado, Your Excellency Lapasov, I would start with you, that you maybe kick us off with some welcoming and opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth Turk, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, allow me to thank UNECE for organizing and inviting me and our delegation to this session. Ladies and gentlemen, Uzbekistan is actively pursuing both regional and global integration. At the regional level, the government is taking measures to expand trade relations with other Central Asian countries. In 2021, as the chair of the United Nations Special Program for the Economies of Central Asia, SPECA, Uzbekistan has stimulated active discussion in the framework of this program, especially with the working groups, including the first meeting of the SPECA working group on cooperation in investment and finance. As regards policy traceability of supply chains in Uzbekistan, I would like to mention that 2 weeks ago, in the framework of the WTO Public Forum, I have presented detailed information on the topic of trade and circular economy. Moreover, it should be noted that in Uzbekistan, we want to introduce green technologies in all spheres, improve efficiency of resource use, encourage enterprises, especially large ones, to adopt sustainable production methods, to report on resource efficiency, and to increase application on environmental standards in public procurement. In this regard, we would like to intensify our cooperation with the UNECE to identify the most feasible and efficient entry points to the circular economy in our country. It should be noted that the textile industry of Uzbekistan, as well as introduction of circular economy, are priority for us, for my cabinet. We are ready to demonstrate tangible outputs and act promptly. Uzbekistan has already proved it in the textile industry, where we have implemented far-reaching state reforms to provide people with a decent work and to eliminate systemic child labor and forced labor. As a result, in March of this year, the global boycott of Uzbekistan cotton products were lifted. In January and May 2022, Uzbekistan exported manufactured textile products worth more than $424 million to 48 foreign countries, which is approximately $90 million higher compared to the same period last year. Now, with the lift of the cotton boycott, Uzbekistan can boost the performance of economic indicators even more. And we are inspired to cooperate with the big international brands and retailers in the garment and footwear industry. Ladies and gentlemen, according to the UNECE policy paper, accelerating the transition towards the circular economy in the UNECE region, policy options for harnessing the power of trade and economic cooperation, the textile industry creates approximately 90 million tons of wastes globally. In total, around $500 billion of value is lost given lack of recycling and poor utilization of clothing, as well as the negative health impact. It means about 8% of dermatological diseases are reported to be caused by the chemicals in the clothing and footwear. To avoid these problems, given the anticipated increase of the textile industry in Uzbekistan, we are interested in cooperation more actively with UNECE on circular economy transition in the textile industry, as well as scaling up this approach to the other sectors. Another point, to prove sustainability and circularity of value chain in Uzbekistan, we need an effective traceability system because a circular economy is relying on the harmonious exchange of data at each stage of the product life cycle. Implementation of the first UNECE blockchain pilot in Uzbekistan already helped us to prove full traceability of finished textile products from field to shelf. I should say that we appreciate the UNECE for its support of our strategy towards sustainable practice in the garment and footwear industry through its sustainability pledge, as you know, signed in March this year during the Tashkent International Investment Forum at the joint UNECE conference, the Sustainable Garment and Footwear Industry of the Future, Innovation for Inclusive and Circular Value Chain, where the prospects for the direction of circular transition in Uzbekistan were discussed. As a result, soon the company where the UNECE blockchain pilot has been implemented is likely to be the first company of Uzbekistan licensed as a better cotton manufacturer. Conformity with the BCI, that's also important, Better Cotton Initiative principles means that Uzbekistan cotton is produced in accordance with environmental, social, and economic requirements. Ladies and gentlemen, Uzbekistan looks forward to working closely with UNECE on the next stage of the project. We are confident that this will also have a potential to reinforce our efforts to make significant progress in WTO accession process, as well as strengthen regional integration with the neighboring countries, including in the framework of the SPECA program. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
Somebody? Good.
Yes.
Thank you. Great. Many thanks, Ambassador, for these opening remarks. And I think you so nicely started off by talking about trade integration, in either WTO accession, but also at the regional level, and then emphasizing the importance of a sector, in that case, textiles. And we know how environmentally and socially sensitive that sector is, but really looking at it from the perspective of opportunities. And it's impressive what you've mentioned in terms of, on the one hand, government reforms, but also growth of the sector. And I think here is really for us to congratulate you and Uzbekistan for what you are achieving. I'm very happy that the work we have been conducting as part of the UNECE Sustainability Pledge, that this is yielding some concrete results. And you nicely flagged sort of the importance of exchanging data throughout the value chain, from the field to the shelf. And so that when we buy a cotton shirt in Geneva with Uzbek cotton, sustainable cotton, that we actually can trace what happened to that shirt along the value chain. So this really, I think, are some important insights. And Ambassador, it was also great that you linked it all up to the circular economy, which is sort of one of the other key topics that UNECE is working on, and particularly when we talk about fashion or we talk about chemicals, circular economy is important. And we need to know what is happening throughout the value chains. So many thanks for making time in your very, very busy schedule to join us here for these opening remarks. Let me now turn to our other panelists, and for the panelists, we thought we'll try to do it a little bit interactive. And I have thought about 3 questions that I'm going to ask the panelists in turn. And the questions are as follows. So first question is really for each of our panelists to talk about the key trends regarding the ESG supply chains and traceability and transparency that they are seeing in their area of work, their organization or their field of work. And I think our panelists come from very different backgrounds, but I am confident that each of them looks at due diligence, ESG supply chains and traceability in one way or the other. After that, I'm going to ask panelists to reflect a little bit about what does this all mean for trade, for supply chains, for trade policy, maybe even for WTO. So we try to identify, is there a link? And if so, how is this link? And what can we do to make that link work in the best possible way? And that's already my third question to close is, what can we all do as international agencies, as development partners, as researchers? What can we do to ensure that this ESG traceability along supply chains, that this really helps us to maximize the benefits of sustainable trade, and that we avoid that this ESG dimension becomes a barrier to trade. And I think particularly when we talk about developing countries, a large part of WTO membership developing countries, or when we look at UNECE, where we have our 17 program countries in Central Asia, Southern Caucasus, Western Balkan, and Eastern Europe, is very important that these ESG standards don't turn into barriers to trade. And I hope that through this debate, we really sort of like also go along with a message that came out very powerfully in the WTO Public Forum, namely that the future of trade is sustainable or green, inclusive and digital. And I think that really sort of is a connecting point for us here. So with this, I would turn to Christian. And Christian, maybe before you start, maybe you can reflect a little bit or tell us what exactly is your function in GIZ and what are you doing with G7, G20 and so forth. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I can certainly talk about myself. That's the easy part of it. So for the last 4 years, I've been supporting the EU in their multilateral diplomacy, particularly in the G7 and the G20 around the green economy. And I do that from working as an external consultant inside GIZ, a large German development cooperation organization. And so I'm here in a personal capacity, not speaking for either of those two organizations, but with quite a lot of knowledge. And before I did that, I worked for many years as a green economy policy strategist inside the EU. And I think it's helpful to take 1 minute to go back and look at the trends in environment policy over the last 20 years. So when I started, environment policy would be trying to solve the solutions which were caused by economic activity or other reasons. And then there was an appreciation that that wasn't going to be enough, and we needed to change the drivers of economic activity so that the environment wasn't degraded. And then the second evolution has been the obvious appreciation that most of the severe environmental and social impacts from economic activity in G7 and OECD countries takes place globally through the value chain. And so in the G7 and the G20, there's been an increasing discussion around what can be done to help shape the economy so that it doesn't cause negative environmental and social impacts through the value chain. And textiles, as we've heard already from the ambassador, a very clear example of that. And textiles leapt to the front of consciousness in 2013 with the Rana Plaza disaster, in which 1,000 people died in a textile factory in Bangladesh. So the textile sector is quite well advanced around traceability, but there's a range of different initiatives which have been looking to provide solutions for different contexts. And fortunately, on the technological side, the solutions are possible. So they need to be adjusted for the particular use cases that are going forward, but the digital technologies which are now available can provide the solutions for access and interoperability of data across global value chains. What's a little bit harder is to design the institutions which support those technical solutions so that they work for everyone through the value chain. But it's also worth discussing now where we are in terms of consumer preference. So I have a focus on the EU, but both in Japan, in the UK, in the US, there's a strong shift in consumer preference towards products which are not causing social and environmental harm. And this then comes out in brands or retailers, whether it's BMW or IKEA, making sure their products through their value chains are not damaging. Equally, in the world of sustainable finance, many more investors want to align their investments with the Sustainable Development Goals. And this starts to be reflected in a series of legislation which embeds those consumer preferences and coordinates them into due diligence requirements or transparency requirements. For example, because it's quite a statement, the EU's Sustainable Product Initiative says that by 2025, all products sold into the EU market must be sustainable. And they mean sustainability through the whole value chain. So to get to this point, to know what is sustainable and to direct purchasing power and investment towards the products which are aligned with sustainable development, we need transparency and traceability through the value chain. And there, I'm glad to say that some of the initiatives have gone quite a long way. UNECE itself has done wonderful work since 2017. They have a network of 250 different experts to provide input on what will work in future, and a network of participating stakeholders who can shape the solutions for the future. I think that sets the scene.
Perfect. Many thanks, Christian. And I think interesting to know that when you talk to sort of the big players like G7 and so forth, that yeah, there is the recognition that the ESG impact happens along the value chain. I think that's one very important finding. And clearly, textiles is sort of like a particularly critical sector. Interesting what you said about the consumer preferences. Yeah, so there is consumer preference or consumer choice to buy sustainable, be it the t-shirt, be it the car. But obviously, there is also this important dimension amongst investors who wish to invest sustainably and who maybe, I could guess, would also want to minimize their risk exposure to ESG risks. So I think that's also an important driver that you highlighted, and very, very curious to learn more about the EU Sustainable Product Initiative. As you said, it's quite a statement, yeah. So definitely something to watch and to follow. So many thanks for setting us off like this, Christian. And let me now turn to Eloise from UNEP. And Eloise, also if you could introduce yourself and the area of work a bit.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm very pleased to be here today. So I'm working in UNEP's economy division in the chemicals and health branch. And I'm working on a particular unit that works with global environment facility funded projects. UNEP's medium-term strategy is oriented around shifting the needle on the triple planetary crisis that we are facing, which is climate, nature, degradation, and pollution. The work of the economy division particularly looks at, well, all three of those, but in particular for pollution and reducing pollution, we're focusing very much on the transition to circular economies and circular supply chains, where obviously waste management and end-of-life management of products and traded goods is critical. But from my particular perspective, the other very important aspect of promoting circular economies and circular products is making sure that the products do not contain hazardous substances that should not be recycled under any circumstances. So the global environment facility projects that we develop and implement aim to reduce chemical pollution and the use of hazardous chemicals in supply chains, and particularly focusing on hazardous chemicals that have global environmental impacts. These are very briefly called persistent organic pollutants, which are governed by the Stockholm Convention on POPs, as well as other conventions, including the Basel Convention on hazardous waste and the Rotterdam Convention on exchange of information on hazardous chemicals. So the reason that chemicals of concern and hazardous substances can act as a brake on circular products and circular economies is in combination with a lack of transparency and a lack of information on the chemicals that are being put into products early in the value chain, it impacts all the subsequent steps of the value chain. For example, workers who are assembling or constructing the final product may be exposed, as has been seen in the electronics sector. And at the end of life, whilst the focus and resources and capacity for recycling is growing, the hazardous chemicals must not be recycled, and so recent research has found levels of POPs, persistent organic pollutants, in children's toys that arise from the inappropriate recycling of plastic components that contained POPs and other chemicals as well. So traceability is important for when there are hazardous chemicals or risk chemicals which need certain measures, personal protective equipment or other kind of measures that can be taken to reduce the risks and the exposure of workers, consumers, recyclers, and recycled products. But it's also an important first step towards phasing out those hazardous substances in the first place, which is our overall objective. As well as the Basel, Stockholm and Rotterdam conventions, which are very hard law kind of global conventions, there's also a voluntary and multi-stakeholder initiative called Strategic Approach for International Chemical Management, or SAICM. I think this is one of the trends that we're seeing, is that in the chemicals community, there are thousands of chemicals out there, thousands of hazardous chemicals, and the rate of banning them through global and hard law instruments is too slow, and we have to move to a more efficient and faster way of regulating chemicals. So the SAICM gives a sort of an alternative modality towards managing hazardous chemicals through as a multi-stakeholder and voluntary instrument that identifies key areas of concern, one of which is chemicals in products. And SAICM, rather than directly trying to, it promotes information exchange and access to information at all levels of the supply chain. So this cannot be done without adequate tools and capacities for transparency and traceability. And so that's why I'm very happy to be here today. Finally, our latest, recent GEF project that we have just launched last week in Pakistan is focusing in on the textile sector. As the previous speakers have mentioned, there are very good practices, there are very good tools, including for chemical management in the textile sector. And I think what we found in our baseline is, first of all, very limited uptake of the existing tools and due diligence and traceability tools that are out there, very limited to export markets and global supply chains with a very high focus on sustainability and, you know, marketed as sustainable products. So our project is aiming to expand the use of those tools and train a diverse and more larger group of manufacturers to be able to apply them. And that could include local companies and small and medium enterprises, so that they can integrate chemical management and thus have access and, you know, a wider opportunity for exporting, but also trading their products locally. Thank you.
Many thanks, Eloise. And I think there are a lot of interesting points. It's good that you remind us of this triple planetary crisis, no? Climate, nature, pollution, that really sort of stands at the beginning of many of the activities we have in the UN. I found it really interesting how you flagged that basically lack of information about chemicals can be a limit to circularity. And in UNECE, we are so much talking about expanding the circular economy these days, but it's quite clear from the example that you gave that if we don't know what happens to a chemical in a production process, or to a good along the production process at the beginning, that might be quite quite dangerous, actually, if we think about the toys you mentioned. Also very interesting what you mentioned about the different type of conventions. So this hardcore legally binding BRS convention, POP convention, but a much softer mechanism happening now, the multi-stakeholder platform in terms of the cycle. And the relevance of information exchange in this. So I think that links back to traceability that we see in different international legal fora, that this recognition of the importance of traceability. And maybe a bit of a reality check when you talk about the project you just launched, that uptake of transparency and traceability is still limited, but we hope to see more of that in the future. Now, let me turn to my right-hand side. I have here with us Ruby Lambert, and Ruby, you have for many years worked in UNCTAD on trade issues and on UNFSS. So please tell us a little bit how these issues of supply chain traceability, ESG traceability feature in your work at UNCTAD.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you, fellow panelists. As Elizabeth has rightly mentioned, apart from my work in UNCTAD, I'm also the Secretariat of the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, an initiative of 6 UN agencies where UNECE obviously is also a part of the steering committee. Before I speak on the supply chains, let me just introduce to you the voluntary sustainability standards, which is also a tool that has been widely used in global supply chains. As you know, voluntary sustainability standards, as you rightly hear the name itself, it's a voluntary guidelines that has been used by producers, manufacturers, traders, retailers, and service providers to demonstrate their commitment to good environmental, social, ethical, and food safety practices. They are consumer-facing labels that you see on your products like Fairtrade, UTZ, Rainforest Alliance, PEFC, Better Cotton Initiative, 4C, etc. And they also include the entirety of the verification process, often referred to as certification schemes. Now, in relation to supply chains, this certification acts as a traceability process handled from the upstream to the downstream end of the supply chain. However, there are also challenges that we have to take note attached to the idea of mainstreaming VSS, despite the fact that they can be a tool to meet sustainability objectives, and in some cases act as an instrument for de facto market access. Typically, what has been identified and perceived as challenges mainly concerns developing countries and emerging economies to some extent. They include high costs of compliance and adaptation, sometimes irrelevance of foreign standards to local conditions, sometimes also lack of timely and adequate information, consequent transaction costs, difficulties in understanding the requirements. There are also confusion from the proliferation of VSS. There are many VSSs that are available in the global market. And some of these requirements and criteria are also overlapping each other. So this also has issues with reducing the capacity for testing and monitoring in conformity, for example, in conformity assessments. There also has been uncertainty that arises from the rapidly changing requirements in overseas market. So as a producer in these export markets, it can be also interpreted as a potential barriers to trade for them as well. So for our work in UNCTAD, we pay particular attention to the risk of fragmentation of regulation, which may disproportionately hurt producers and companies in developing countries, especially small, medium enterprises and smallholder farmers. So the real challenge in this context is to effectively achieve not just the sustainability outcomes of such use, but an equitable implementation that addresses the challenges arising from differential capacities and power and information asymmetries. So our collaboration with within the UNFSS together with UNECE is that we want to achieve this goal towards a more sustainable value chain and trade. We are in fact launching our UNFSS 5th flagship report on sustainability agenda and developing countries' opportunities and challenges on this 26th of October, actually just next week. And I would also like to invite all of you, if you are available, to join our discussion either virtually or in Brussels on the 26th of October. And if you want more information, it's on unfss.org. And it's interesting because we also have a box on UNECE. So what I wanted to highlight from this is that to foster VSS effectiveness for sustainability is being able to measure it. And measurement requires transparency and traceability. And for this, we take note UNECE's Sustainable Pledge Initiative for Sustainable Value Chains in the garment and footwear industry to improve transparency and traceability. So if I may, I would just also like to congratulate you on the pledge. But I think that's a very good step forward. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ruby. And you know, the team producing the pledge is sitting here in the room, so they really deserve the credit here. That was very interesting because you really started us off again by reminding us of this consumer-facing label. You mentioned them all and saying, actually, if we want to know what is happening, there's a whole verification certification process behind it, both upstream and downstream. And you rightly said, we need to be able to measure things, and we need to be able to trace things. And then you so well emphasize the challenges that this can create, challenges for developing countries in terms of the costs, the relevance of the items or the issues addressed in the standards, capacity challenges in terms of implementation, but also capacity challenges in terms of testing and monitoring. And I think that's a very, very valid point, as well as the whole issue of risk of fragmentation, too many different standards around, really hard for small suppliers to comply, really hard for suppliers from developing countries to comply. And I would say that many of the challenges you mentioned, Ruby, they not only apply to the developing world, but they would also apply to SMEs and producers in UNECE's 17 program countries, be it in Central Asia, Caucasus, the Balkans, and so forth. So many thanks for that contribution, and very curious to attend and join the launch of the flagship report. Now, let me turn to our online speaker, and Paul has been with us and patiently waiting here on the screen. Paul, you're representing here the Clean Clothes campaign. So you have long experience in terms of textiles, again, the very sensitive sector we started off with. And Paul, you've also worked with UNECE in the context of the Sustainability Pledge. If you could tell us a bit more about how sort of like do these issues play out in your organization's work, and what are the key trends you're seeing?
Yeah, let me start off by saying thank you for having me. I work with the Clean Clothes campaign, which indeed is a global network that is focused on the labor conditions and other conditions in the global garment industry. But also I've worked on a lot of related issues. I am also on the board of the Open Supply Hub, which used to be known as the Open Apparel Registry, but it's expanding beyond apparel into general supply chain. And that is a pre-competitive data sharing hub where producing entities, factories, facilities can be registered and can be monitored for correctness of spelling and other things. And I'll come back to a little bit on why that technology is really important. I've also worked quite a bit on the CSRD, the upcoming EU legislation, and I'm currently involved with EFRAG on setting up the sustainability reporting standards that go with that legislation. So in the textile and garment sector, we already have a fairly developed landscape in due diligence and traceability and transparency. That is because, well, as the previous speaker mentioned, it had a very rude wake-up call in the Rana Plaza disaster. That led to originally Clean Clothes Campaign and 8 other organizations calling for the Transparency Pledge in 2016, which in many ways is sort of a precursor to the Sustainability Pledge. At a time when transparency was almost unheard of. It was still very much thought of as that is a trade secret, that cannot never be shared, that this would not be helpful for in any way for international trade. But 5 years later, actually that discussion has been almost done. It has been made clear by very successful companies that you can provide at least tier 1 transparency and still maintain a very healthy supply chain. So many of the issues and fears that were around have proven unsustained. You can be transparent and traceable, and in the current climate, we say you actually need to be. In textile, as in many other sectors, but I'm focusing on the textile sector, you can't really separate social and environmental issues. They're quite often intertwined. For instance, dyeing with harmful chemicals is not only a social issue, but it also directly affects communities literally downstream from the factories where this is happening and who are confronted with the wastewater of these processing plants. But also the issues of landfill. Tens of thousands of tons of clothes are dumped each year in the Atacama Desert in Chile, which is a highly vulnerable region, and last year a very large part of them caught on fire, which led to further harm to surrounding communities. But also even in a larger picture, a very large percentage of the global textile industry is currently based in countries and cities that are extremely vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise. In Bangladesh, in the Mekong area, there is an astounding amount of the global garment sector that is in very vulnerable coastal areas. So while the amount of production in the global garment industry actually contributes to climate change, it is also ironically very threatened by it. So there is a interest also to combat that, to stop the overproduction, to come to a more sustainable and model. But also there's upcoming legislation. As I said, there's EU legislation, but there's also increasing sensibility around greenwashing. I will not name the company, but a very large Swedish garment company was basically forced to retract their conscious and environmental claims because both the Norwegian and the Dutch consumer protection agencies found that those claims were not actually founded or could not be proven by anything. And thus they were misleading consumers, and thus those claims had to be removed. And that is something that we see more and more of. So in accordance with also the UNECE policy recommendation number 46, which was on enhancing traceability and transparency. It is a very long policy recommendation, but I always like to summarize it by all sustainability claims should present verifiable proof. That's the very short version of it. I'm sure Elizabeth will say that's a bit too shortened, but it is one essential thing. If you want to claim to be sustainable, nowadays you cannot just go out and say it. You have to you have to prove it, and it has to be verifiable. And to do verification at scale, which is also something that we will be faced with more and more, we need open data. Because open data allows many more actors to become part of the verification. It allows civil society to become part of the verification, but it also lowers the cost dramatically for small and medium enterprises. If there is open data, you can have civil society or government organizations helping SMEs in providing the information. As as the information is more standardized, you can help with tools that are easy to fill out on a mobile phone, thus closing that information gap between people in Western countries with access to computers and people in the developing world who often only have access through mobile phones. So open data and standardization are going to be highly important to this, because it expands the amount of actors that can help in inputting the information, checking the information, verifying the information, and learning from the information and acting upon it. Also for consumers, you can have a consumer that is more interested in greenhouse gases or in water use or in social conditions. They can basically pick and choose which indicators they find the most important. So it also empowers consumers to direct their own behavior better. That's it for now, I think.
Many thanks, Paul, and lovely how you said UNECE recommendation 46. You put in a few words. All sustainability claims should present verifiable proof. So you're really a wonderful spokesperson for our recommendation here. It was super interesting what you said in terms of that in practice, environmental and social aspects cannot be sort of disassociated. Yeah, they belong together, and you also linked it to climate change. And I think as we are looking towards COP27, this is really in all of our minds. So I think that's a really important takeaway. And Paul, interesting from you to hear, who has worked on these topics for a long time, that 5 or more years ago, we were not at all in the debate where we are now, and that transparency and sustainability, there were many more questions around. There still are questions, but 5 years ago, many more questions, and that concepts such as traceability have been or were being questioned also from a sort of trade secret perspective. So I think that's really important to remember where this debate is coming from and how it has changed over the years. Also very interesting what you said at the end in terms of can we make this quest for information exchange and transparency sort of like an interactive process? Maybe we can actually help companies provide this data, and that's maybe something to explore for the future as well. So I would close now here the first round of questions, where we've really tried to hear from our panelists, how does this topic of traceability, ESG dimension in supply chains and traceability, how does it show up in your areas of work, and what are key trends that you have witnessed? And I think we've really sort of seen a wide range of different comments on that. There is quite some literature around on this as well. I've read several reports by major think tanks, and also in UNECE we've tried to provide a paper that sort of reviews a little bit what are the key regulatory and developments in this regard. Now it's going to be a little bit more tricky, because we want to zoom in. What does all of this have to do with trade policy, maybe even with WTO? And so my second round of questions to our panelists would be, what does this ESG traceability, why does this matter for WTO, or does it matter? Why does it matter? What does it mean for trade policy? And maybe you can reflect also a little bit, for example, Christian, in the debates you usually are, when you really look at this ESG dimension in supply chains, do the trade policy aspects come up here? Is there a connection between the sustainability supply chains community and the trade policy community? What are your reflections about this?
Well, thank you. I think it matters because it's absolutely essential to align global trade with sustainability, which, put a little more provocatively, is the same as saying that if we don't get this right, the work which we undertake in the WTO is driving the world towards global environmental catastrophe and social catastrophe at the same time. And nobody really wants to do that. So more specifically, as has been mentioned, it's also important to make sure that this unavoidable change is not set up in a way which constructs a technical barrier to trade. And it is, as with so much of the digital world, perfectly possible to design these digital tools so that they could create a technical barrier to trade. The data which is going to be included in traceability is data which could have a huge economic value. So it's not only data which is about product characteristics, but also about the economic relationships between the actors in the value chain. as we know, looking at the world's biggest companies, data is incredibly valuable, and there's a strong economic incentive to capture that value amongst any actor, whether for strategic or profit motives. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen in the case of traceability. And that, I believe, means looking very carefully at the governance structures. That's the rules and the processes by which data is accessed or generated or transferred, and the incentives which go with that. In the work that I've been doing around the G7, those governance aspects are ones which we've just started looking at and have got a couple of reports out and hope to do more before February next year. But there's a lot of work to be done, and it will require participation from all of the stakeholders. In the G7 at the moment, under the lead of the German presidency, different regional workshops are looking at some of the overarching principles which would guide good governance for the future that works for the whole value chain. And it's possible that having a look at those principles is something which would also matter to the WTO.
Many thanks, Christian. And so you really sort of said, yes, indeed, it does matter, but please.
But what I didn't say is in the discussions around the G7 and the G20, there isn't any connection made to the trade community. And the trade issues have not yet been discussed. They focus rather more on the environment or the practical solutions for trying to get increased traceability.
Great, thank you. So on the one hand, we see that there is a link, it does matter. And I think so many of our speakers have emphasized like supply chains and trade related topics in the first round intervention. And on the other hand, we see that maybe the communities, the policymakers, maybe even the researchers, the academics are not yet linked and looking at that interaction from what I could assume. Now, Christian, it was also really interesting what you said about digitalization and access to data in terms that there is a risk that it turns into a barrier to trade, and how important it therefore is to really get this governance structure right, this governance structure of, and that is being discussed in some of the fora that you are attending. So I would say really already one important finding that this needs to be explored a little bit more, and maybe that the communities need to sort of like interact a little bit more. Let me pose the same question to Eloise. When you are working on the chemicals, and the chemicals along the supply chains of many different products, is there a trade angle coming up, and if so, how?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you to Christian for your comments there. I mean, I think from my project, hat, I think we see that trade is really a massive motivation for driving improved practices. And, for the companies that I met in Pakistan last week, where we visited some textile mills, and we've been, talking to tier 2, tier 3 manufacturers. The kind of carrot of international trade is a vast carrot, and it has driven improved practices across all of UNEP's priority issues on climate change, but also nature protection, water use, as well as chemical management. So and I think some of the tools that the other panelists mentioned, especially in terms of VSS, we heard about Better Cotton Initiative, these are all very powerful drivers for improving the sustainability and the sustainable performance of manufacturing and production. And I suppose that, the main relevance I would see is how to expand that from what is, currently traded globally, but recognizing that there are still many parts of value chains that are not able to access those global opportunities and those global, better practices. So our project priorities are really working with other companies, SMEs especially, but also local producers, local traders, to see how those tools can be adapted. I think Paul's comment on open data and just having alternative ways of collecting data and having traceability and transparency of information is very interesting, because the cost of verification and third-party verification, which comes along with the better known VSSs, you know, it is prohibitive for large parts of the value chains. And so looking at, you know, alternative ways that can bring the cost of that down, possibly as a stepping stone towards, you know, the gold standard of third-party verified standards. I noted, you know, the possibility of that to create trade barriers, and I think we are all very much we know that, you know, knowledge is power, data is power, and companies are not very keen to share it unless they absolutely have to. Looking in the chemicals world, both the Basel and the Rotterdam conventions have developed and have got you know, globally accepted and agreed mechanisms for information exchange on hazardous waste, as well as for chemicals that are globally traded. But I suppose my observation is that that's very much limited to governments, because the conventions affect governments, so governments may or may not, you know, in practice, oblige their exporters and importers to share that information. But those modalities are not widespread in the rest of the value chain. So I think that could be kind of interesting to use the trade and economic policy tools that we have at disposition to try and influence and bring in some of those, you know, agreed modalities into a wider group of chemicals or, you know, products even. The BRS conventions have, you know, I think there is a kind of a legal understanding that, well, in theory anyway, health and environmental data should be not covered by commercial confidentiality. So in, you know, in theory, but obviously it's a bit more hard to make that applied in practice. In terms of my work, there are sort of different areas for both chemicals, which is a huge industry, as well as the products that, you know, are heavy users of chemicals. Chemicals trade is obviously growing. It's a very rapidly growing sector, and in UNEP's Global Chemical Outlook, the prediction is that the manufacture of chemicals is increasingly being moved to Asia especially, but also other lower middle income kind of countries. So while obviously there are hundreds of thousands of chemicals, we're going to focus in on a few thousand which are hazardous for health or the environment. And, you know, the reality for many lower middle income countries is that they don't adequately the chemicals that are being imported. There are very limited requirements for declarations or reporting that are basically for the persistent organic pollutants or a handful of hazardous chemicals that have been listed in conventions. And other than that, most countries that I work with in my projects, you know, don't track the full range of hazardous chemicals. And here I'm talking, you know, there are many chemicals that are not immediately toxic, but for example, endocrine disrupting chemicals are widely used in all sorts of, you know, from cosmetics, even in medicines. Pharmaceutical products can be environmentally persistent. These are chemical groups that are never going to be part of the Stockholm Convention or the Rotterdam Convention. And so we need to find kind of alternative ways to support customs especially, but, you know, governments generally, to know what's coming in so that they can take the measures that are needed in, you know, whether it's transport, distribution, retail, even users, to protect and reduce the risks of exposures and emissions. Looking at products, UNEP's strategy is to really focus in on 4 sectors that are very heavy users of hazardous chemicals in particular, which are textiles, electronics, mining sector and plastics, they all are very heavy users of chemicals generally, including hazardous chemicals. And for all of those products, which are very widely traded globally, the importing regions, the EU, the US, are, have got quite strong restrictions. And I think Christian mentioned the Sustainable Products Initiative that's coming. Those can be quite challenging for exporting countries, and there are kind of many cases of accidental or intentional contamination, which, those products that are then not imported into the EC are not thrown away, they're traded and used locally. So it's not like the problem just disappears. Those contaminated products are still around and they just expose other people. So from a development perspective, it's important that, as well as looking at the big global value chains, we do also look at smaller local producers. And I think finding ways for those local producers to share, to collect in the first place the data on the chemicals use, but the other traceability issues, and then kind of record it and share it. And I think from UNEP's perspective, we're very excited to be working with UNECE to kind of work on your blockchain pilot and try and expand it a little bit into these chemicals and pollution and waste management issues too.
Many thanks, Eloise, and for really, you're the expert on these difficult chemicals and products, and you differentiate it. It's really important that there are two angles: the chemicals themselves, and there is a well-established legal regime, BRS convention, the POPs framework, and then we have all these products where chemicals are inside and which are traded, and where we also need to know basically what is the risk that they can have. And you mentioned some of the hotspot sectors: textiles, electronics, mining, plastics. And I would say they are very well recognized also in UNECE in terms of the importance of traceability there. Now, I liked very much at the beginning, Eloise, when you said like the carrot of international trade is driving change. And I think here it's really that the idea is we want to make this trade green and digital and inclusive. And so if we look at it as a carrot, as an opportunity, rather than as a barrier. But you also mentioned that in many value chains, many value chains are not yet linked to this international trade, and the questions are particularly problematic for SMEs. So I think that's all very, very exciting. One further thing comes to my mind. You talked a lot about this information exchange between governments and the information exchange between companies. And I guess this matters a lot in terms of what framework are we looking at here? Is it for governments to exchange information or for companies? And obviously that creates a whole lot of ramifications and follow-up implications for how we address it. So many thanks for sharing your thoughts on that from the UNEP perspective. Let me now turn to Ruby. And Ruby, you're working for UNCTAD. So in UNCTAD, really, like international trade is sort of the topic throughout. And what's your answer? What's your take on this question? Supply chain traceability, does it matter for international trade? Does it matter for trade policy and WTO?
Thank you. Thank you. See, as you mentioned, trade is absolutely at the heart of the work that we do. The thing is, so the GATT agreements and then afterwards the WTO post-Uruguay round, it has all about reducing market access barriers. And during the last couple of decades, there has been an increased interest in standards and regulations. So the thing is, as tariff barriers decline, other trade policy instruments such as TBT and SBS start to increase as well. Furthermore, the attention today has also moved towards greening global supply chains through sustainability standard settings. These are typically private standards and voluntary in nature. They arise mainly to fill the gaps in the formal standards development system, also mainly to raise the bar towards achieving higher levels of sustainable development. So the key reason why there has been a large shift to private standards is that there has been a great emergence of global value chains. Today, we don't just see one product produced in country A and immediately consumed in country B. In between, there are many other activities also involved. So this private standards are a tool to effectively and systematically manage global supply chains through traceability and also meeting the chain of custody. And I'm also going to bring back the whole open data, which is true. What we also want is to systemize data governance. And in the world of sustainability standards, this is still very much lacking. So on top of that, I think, Christian, you also mentioned about the shifting consumer preference. So the thing about consumers is they're also becoming very aware of sustainability issues. But the problem is that this whole proliferation and multiplication of the schemes that we have so many today have resulted to confusion among the customers as well. So there has they are also affecting the increasing cost of production and exports from developing countries. This proliferation is bringing significant challenges to the legitimacy of the trade system. So the problem arises on the different interpretation of legitimate between intentional protectionist measure and non-protectionist measure. So what we want to address is the impact of sustainability standards on supply chains and the entirety of global trade. And for that, we need to be able to measure impact systematically, like you mentioned, the ESG. For UNFSS, it is important to recognize that standards are not simply technical matters, which is why the very intention of UNFSS is also to create a global platform that factors in the special needs of the developing countries in their preparation and application to have the needed institutional capacities, which also matches to the developed world as well. How do we do this? We do this through research, very important component in our output, which is why we wanted more transparency in data, for example, and also through technical capacities, capacity building. And very importantly as well, to lift any form of barriers that limits the developing countries' participation in global dialogue. Because at the end of the day, developing countries and emerging economies need to also undertake efforts to make their exports environmentally friendly and socially acceptable. So the external pressures, these sort of external pressures to bring about changes is, not always a bad thing. Not only do sustainability standards aim to meet the demands of sustainable development, but they can also raise the bar for developing countries and emerging economies to be on par with the developed market counterparts. So I hope that explains or answers your question.
Many thanks, Ruby. And I think it's very interesting when you say that maybe the complexity, the increasing complexity of value chains, it's maybe a reason, a driver behind this proliferation of international standards and private standards, voluntary sustainability standards. And then obviously this proliferation also creates confusion, and this might be difficulty, not only for the consumers, but also for the exporters from developing countries. I guess what we are also hearing here is that there is very little research out on that still, and there is some research already emerging. And I think you're going to have a academic conference next week with the participation of some prominent trade economists, Bernhard Hockmann. And I think that will be quite interesting how you try to provide us some data on what's actually the impact of these voluntary sustainability standards. You also linked it to the importance of data and traceability. And you mentioned some of the WTO agreements. So here again, in the preparation for this panel, I did a little bit of research, and I found hardly anything that looks at supply chain traceability, due diligence, the topics we are discussing here, and sort of like matches it with the WTO agreement. So that's definitely an area to be looked at. Now, let us turn to Paul, who is with us on the screen. In your work, when you, as the Clean Clothes campaign, have you worked on trade policy issues and have they come up?
Yes, we have worked on trade issues, mostly up till now on regional trade agreements, such as GSP Plus, the Everything But Arms schemes, but also mechanisms like the US withhold release orders on various issues having to deal with forced labor. So we have worked on that because these are mechanisms where you can basically apply an emergency brake when there is really serious human rights or environmental violations. But that's at the same time also a bit of the problem. It is only an emergency brake. It is sort of like, it's a last resort. It is like violations of various standards are so enormous that we have to really go punish. But there is no way, those mechanisms do not actually encourage or incentivize good behavior. They do not incentivize going beyond the bare minimum to not be kicked out of a GSP or a similar trade agreement. So I think, yeah, we think that in future there should be, and this is going to be difficult because how do you measure it? But in principle, you would want to reward good behavior. You would want to reward supply chains that have reduced their water consumption, that have reduced their use of chemicals. And of course, that is difficult to do through a trade mechanism. But quite often, yeah, these kinds of things do take investments. That's why, first of all, ESG data is important so that company suppliers can get these green investments, because more and more these investments, for instance, through the EU, which has a substantial a green policy plan, to open up that kind of financing, not only to major companies, but also to SMEs in developing countries. They would have to provide that SME data. But in the end, you would basically want more favorable trade agreements for those companies, supply chains, producers that go beyond the bare minimum, instead of what we currently have as trade is only that sort of like really crude tool of stopping certain products from entering the market, which, yeah, will probably still be needed as an emergency brake, but it's not a policy instrument. It's too blunt. As said, yeah, traceability, transparency is so important. Consumers want it, investors want it, the Green Deal financing wants it. But if we want to turn trade more into an enabling mechanism towards the top and not to have this race towards the bottom, I think we will need more tools than these crude emergency brakes. And how to implement that is probably going to be really difficult. So, and I know there are far many more trade experts in the room than I am. So my message to the trade experts in the room would be, think about how trade can be more of an enabling tool to say, like, positive steps should be rewarded instead of like negative steps should be punished, because that creates a different dialogue, a different mechanism, and hopefully, yeah, a self sustaining move towards changing this enormous oil tanker of global supply chains. It will take many years to change, but it's going to take more than sanctions. We also need carrots, as Elizabeth named them. And some of those carrots can hopefully be in the form of favorable trade agreements.
Many thanks, Paul. So you're really looking at this maybe less from a multilateral trade policy angle, but more from a regional, and you've mentioned Everything But Arms and the GSP Plus standards. And I think that links us also back to opening remarks by Ambassador at the very beginning, who has told us about sort of the positive experience of Uzbekistan being taken off the cotton boycott, and now really the impressive development of the textiles industry there. Paul, you've also given us a reality check. Now, if you're really wanting that trade to be green, inclusive, and using digitalization for it, if we want to create this enabling mechanism through trade, maybe we don't yet have the right tools. And the big question out there to all the trade policymakers in the room also is, what are these right tools? Yeah, like how can we shape these tools so that we are not using the stick so much, but really using the carrot, and that we ultimately can ensure that developing countries and countries with economies in transition are benefiting from the opportunity here. Paul, you've also opened up another debate. Yeah, you've started talking about investment. And I think particularly when we look at value chains, at supply chains, trade and investment are intrinsically linked. And if we want to turn these value chains into sustainable, green, inclusive value chains and using the power of data for doing that, we need to look at both the trade angle and the investment angle. And I think that's also a message we had this morning in UNECE in our meetings in the run-up to COP, that trade and investment and financing and the expectations of investors are really important to consider here. Now, that was our second round of questions, trying to figure out, like, what does this debate about transparency, ESG dimension and ESG transparency and traceability of supply chains, what does it actually have to do with trade? I would say there was a clear yes, it has something to do with trade, but it seems to me that the communities are not yet very much connected, and it's still a little bit hard to really pin down where the policy connections, and I feel we have maybe more open questions than solutions. But this is also why it's good to have this debate here, and I would be delighted also to see what the audience has to say and whether there are any questions. We received one question diving into the textiles value chain, where a gentleman from Cameroon asks us whether, when speaking of the supply value chains and companies operating in textiles, whether it's possible to have a management model for derivatives that allows us to protect the environment. So maybe that's also going a little bit in the maybe supply chain and the investment dimension, but I'm just flagging this as we have received it from the people, the colleagues manning the chat. Now, to close our discussion up here, we have a little bit more than 10 minutes left. I would now ask our panelists, what can we all do? There is one hand in the room. If you would wish to identify yourself and pose a question, please do so.
I'll have mine of the One Goal Initiative. This would be a question for Paul. You mentioned open data. Now, the question is, the work of verification will be done by somebody, and the organizations or the individuals who will do this, who will pay them? So we look at either donors or shareholders or individuals investing their time. Now, if I look at open source software, the last thing I've heard was that the people contributing were asking to get paid now. And then donors and shareholders, they have each their own stakes in the various activities. So there should be a way to govern this question before we just jump into it. Anybody else can also, of course, intervene, not only Paul.
Many thanks for this question. So it's really also about incentives and remuneration when we approach that question of open data. I see one more hand was raised, I feel. Could it be that we have somebody who would wish to contribute? Let me see. I think it was a gentleman called Umed. Yeah. If we can bring him on, that would be amazing.
Greetings from Uzbekistan. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name is Umit Yakubjayev. I'm the chairperson of the WTO chair at the University of World Economy and Diplomacy. First of all, I would like to thank the panel for the very interesting contributions and the discussion. Being a representative of academic community, I'm curious what the panelists think about the role of academia in environmental, social, and governance traceability of supply chains. How do you particularly see academia being involved in the implementation of research into practice and in formulating policies to promote traceability of supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Delighted to have you with us, Umed, as the representative of WTO Chairs Program. A really, I would say, very interesting initiative of academic institutions working on trade law issue. And you posed a very practical question. What's the role of academia, both in policy formulation and also in implementation? And if I'm not mistaken, I think, Umed, you're also from Uzbekistan. So I think the question would be very relevant also for the country in terms of its accession process. I'll fold it into the response from our panelists here and merge it with my question, which was really, what can we all do to sort of like improve that situation, and what can we all do, be it in international organizations, in think tanks, in delegations, in countries, in the private sector, or in academia as Umed? What can we do to really harness the power of these value chains and make them environmentally and socially sort of like more beneficial? What are the action points we can do to make trade green, inclusive, and digital, as the message came out from the public forum? Let me start with Christian.
I think there is a way to try to answer all the questions together. And that's because to design a system and the governance in the incentive system which works for everyone, there will be a need to have a huge amount of participation from people who know the situations in the individual use cases and individual geographies. And that means constructing a form of dialogue involving many multiple parties in different situations around the world, but finding a way to extract the key lessons from those and allow differentiation. And that is the kind of process which needs to have a very large and respected convening organization to be able to get the critical mass of people working towards a common goal, rather than a splintering, which Ruby has mentioned, of many different initiatives in different directions. And so that's possible. There is no organization which currently has that role. So that's possibly something which could be of interest to the WTO. And you also said, Eloise, that SACIM is a way to go forward. So the chemicals organization, which looks at non-regulatory or less hard ways of creating implementation mechanisms for moving forward in this direction. And that might also be an inspiration as to what we could do in a multilateral way here.
Great. Two concrete things: dialogue, critical mass of people, avoiding splintering, and maybe the less hard way of doing things. No, let me go the same. Or Ruby, shall we change direction?
Thank you. It's a very good question. Actually, in order to achieve sustainable development, this is a multi-stakeholder approach. It's a multi-stakeholder initiatives. Not each stakeholder working in silos. It's an effort for all stakeholders involved. And I think there is a huge role for academic in this role as well. I'm just going to highlight that the UNFSS has an academic advisory council. Particularly for that, there is a very important role for the academics in achieving sustainable development. And why? Because for policy formulation, for how do we look in the future, there needs to be empirical evidences and credible research studies. And this, we're talking about measuring impact. How we measure impact will help us identify the problematic, not just in a macro level, but also micro, and how to address them, either in a multi-stakeholder initiative or as or in a policy through policy changes or reforms, or so like I said, there are many roles for each stakeholder, and academic is definitely one of the most important role to make this a reality. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ruby. And I can see why you were like really very pertinent to chip in here. The multi-stakeholder approach is core to UNFSS and that role of academia. So maybe there is a potential cooperation that can come out of this as well. Now, Eloise, let me turn to you as representative from UNEP, another UN agency like UNECE. What do you think can be done to basically harness the power of trade for the SDGs?
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. I suppose I wanted to just come back to the fact that trade is already being harnessed to promote sustainable development. And especially I've heard, you know, today and generally, I think the trade community has embraced the climate change and the energy issues, for example, which are key for you know, the global environment. So I suppose one, you know, one suggestion or hope that I could have is that, you know, that the other aspects of the planetary crisis that we find ourselves in can be picked up with the same, you know, enthusiasm and seriousness of the trade community. The SciCam is indeed an open, multi-stakeholder and voluntary initiative, and I think it very much meets the requirements that we've been talking about today, in the sense that it's open for anyone to join. It's in fact in a kind of renewal phase where Beyond 2020 instrument is actively being designed now, and I think that, you know, the trade community is not represented there. In this second iteration of SciCam as a tool, the first one since 2006 was very much focused on, you know, getting consensus around technical topics, identifying chemicals, identifying, you know, priority issues. We have a good grounding for that now, and in the negotiations that are ongoing, the role of economic and trade policy is really coming up strongly. And frankly, you know, we don't have stakeholders in that community who are able to, you know, give us the, you know, your brains, basically. I think the trade community has come a long way and encountered many problems with dealing with climate change and kind of sustainable development, the wider sustainable development goals. And I think your lessons are super important for us. Environment ministries are often overwhelmed by the challenges that they face, whilst also not being seen or not being resourced in the same way that, for example, you know, trade, economy ministries are. So I think there's definitely lessons that we would welcome. And that goes as well for the academic community. In answer to the question that came, SciCam has a strong representation from academia, but it's mostly environmental, chemical, technical researchers. And we're looking to expand the social sciences and as well economic theory in there as well. So, yeah.
Many thanks. So here also a little bit like a call for breaking down the silos and engaging the communities, and maybe we can benefit from how the trade community has been engaged in the climate and in the energy discussion, and maybe this can also happen a little bit more in the specific to it. And SciCam with its sort of like soft structure maybe really provides an opportunity. And interesting also here the point that environment ministries might actually benefit from the expertise that is around in some of the other domains. So many thanks for that. And with the last 2 minutes, let me turn to Paul on the screen. From your perspective, or from Clean Clothes campaign perspective, what can we do to make that all of that work better?
Yeah, and I also want to answer to that question about open source and open data not being free. You should not underestimate the costs currently of having multiple non-open structures. We know of garment factories that gets visited 17 times per year by different auditors. And all of these audits are not made public. It would be much quicker if there would be less audits. Those results would be public and the local trade union can help verify those results. So there is already lots of money is being wasted by closed source auditing mechanisms. So I think there is a lot of efficiency gains to be had there. And also, well, data has improved so much. If I order as a private person something now from the internet, from anywhere in the world, they will keep me up to date to the minute, almost to an annoying level of where my package is and where it has moved. So logistics companies have sort of mastered quite a bit of this as well. And I think we can learn from that because they're doing it at scale and at remarkably low cost levels and at a remarkable efficiency. So I think there we can gain a lot. And especially with that open data and with academics, we could do so much more machine learning, like analysis at scale. What are trends? What are hotspots? Those are things that you can ask a modern day machine learning program a lot more about. And I think we can then benefit more from, hey, there are hotspots here, there are obvious trade issues here, there are waste management issues here. We see a lot of, for instance, garments being imported into a country, sold on the market, but we don't see any recycling taking place. Ooh, red flag, where have they gone? So I think we will need to resort to machine learning and those kinds of automated checks to spotlight and come to a true circular economy.
Many thanks, Paul. So we are really right on time as well, 1 minute past 6. I'm not going to summarize here, just to say it was a super, super interesting debate and great pleasure for me to moderate. We've looked at policy and trends in this area of ESG supply chains and transparency and traceability of in this environmental, social and governance dimensions of supply chains. We've tried to explore a little bit what's the link to trade. We all feel there is a link to trade, yeah, but we've tried to also see what does it mean for trade policy, maybe a little bit more information already available in terms of the regional aspects and maybe a little bit less in terms of the multilateral aspect. And I think we've had really a lot of ideas in terms of what can we all contribute if we want the future of trade to be green, inclusive and digital. And I would say breaking down the silos between the communities is one of them. Doing more research, gathering more evidence is another really important one. And I hope that with today's sessions, we have really inspired each of you to get out of your silo and maybe find somebody in the respective other community, or for those of us who are more engaged in research to really pick that topic and find a policy relevant piece of research that is very much missing in the current puzzle. So with this, a huge thanks from UNECE to all the speakers here with me on the podium and to Paul, who is with us online, to Ambassador Lapasso from the Uzbekistan mission in Geneva here for having joined us for his opening remarks. It's always a great pleasure to work with Uzbekistan, and I think it tied in very, very well with the question we had from Umed. And a big thank you also to the team from WTO for granting this opportunity to UNECE to contribute to your Trade and Environment Week, and also for all the support you provided us with in terms of logistics. So I would close it here. I'm looking at colleagues there. With that, I think we all deserve an applause. We are still a significant number of people at 6 o'clock, and I heard there is some reception waiting somewhere. Thank you.